Hello, I'm Frank Vucolo, and today I'm going to talk about inlay banding, specifically inlay banding of a type that is known by the Seymours. The Seymours were makers in the late early 1800s, so they built furniture in what we call the Federal period. And they were known particularly for a few different bandings. Today I'm going to focus on something called dart pattern banding or line and dart banding. This piece here is a reproduction of a dressing box with the glass that was done by the Seymours around 1795, and it is pretty much representative of their work in that it uses two bandings that they are quite known for. One is the line and dart banding that surrounds the mirror frame here. The other is called lunette banding, and that banding is here on the edge of the top. And those circular patterns were called lunette bandings. It also has a very simple banding. The other is just a black and white surround that separates the maple from the mahogany around it. Today, I want to speak very specifically about the line and dart banding. This has historically been a very difficult banding to reproduce. It requires a lot of precision, like most bandings, but it also requires some difficult cuts across the end grain. The banding is actually made up in the core of alternating chevrons. So if you look closely here, you can, I hope the camera can catch it, you're going to see a V cut here and a point cut on this end. And when we begin to interlock a striped or laminated piece with a solid, we start to get this dart pattern forming between the lines, thus line and dart banding. And you can see that starting to come together. We'll glue up a number of these into a pack, and then we'll laminate that pack between two darker bandings, and you can see the pattern emerging. That pattern will be sliced off of this pack, and you'll get individual strips of banding that can then be inlaid into the work like so. This particular banding I'm holding in my hand is made from rosewood for the dark material and holly for the light. The remainder of this pack, which has already been sliced up, is the ebony and holly banding that I actually used on that mirror surround. So that's the process. We make a pack, we slice it into banding. As I mentioned earlier, we've got two types of chevrons. One is a laminated chevron, dark, light, and dark. And that starts from some solid pieces of rosewood and holly that we'll slice. And I slice the veneers on the table saw into veneers. And these veneers will come right off of the pack. And then we'll laminate them like so, light, dark, light, to create the 3-ply that's going to become these longer dark chevrons. Okay, so once we've got those chevrons, we've got this pack of laminated together, we'll have to slice those chevrons off and put the point and the V on them. And to do that, I'll use and by the way, the solid chevrons are going to be cut from a solid piece of holly, the same thickness as the lamination that we put together. And it's important that these thicknesses be exactly the same. And let's talk about how we get that done. We'll slice pieces off of this pack, this piece of holly, like so, and I use a bandsaw for that, until we get the smaller pieces. We then take those smaller pieces over to this vertical router table. This is a vertical router table that I designed specifically for cutting these chevrons. It works very simply. I call it a tombstone because it's basically a tombstone with a small fence put on it, and it accepts a small router. This is a Bosch Colt, but any palm router will do. It'll mount on the back. All right, the router's in a horizontal position because we have a vertical router table, and we'll mount a cutter in there. And I don't know if the camera can get in on that, but that cutter is a 60-degree V bit. So that's going to cut a 60-degree V into the chevron, leaving the resulting 30-degree angles on the chevron itself. And perhaps we can see here how that's going to make that cut. When we do the other side, we take a half pass on one side, flip it over, take a half pass on the other side, and we get the point on the end of the chevron. And that's the process for making these. The trick is that it's very difficult to hold tiny pieces on a router table. So what I've done is I've devised a few material handling tools. We'll call this a push-in stick, because this is going to hold the stock tight against the table. And remember, the table is vertical, this is the table, this is the fence. That will hold it in. I've got two indentations here to give me good pressure. And then this is called a hold down hammer. And that hold down hammer will go on top, so that as I hold the push stick in against the table, I can press the hammer down with this finger and use a very simple block here to push everything past the cutter. And that's the process by which we'll cut the material. And you'll see that later in some close-up video. So that's what we're going to do today. And what follows will be some video on the various procedures. How we slice the veneer, how we laminate the first piece, how we sand things to exact thicknesses, how we cut the chevrons to the proper length, how we run them through the tombstone router table to create the V's and the points that are needed, and then the process by which the whole thing is glued up and sliced off to become this really neat banding. The processes that I'm using are those of a modern shop. We're using table saws and sanding drums and the like, but the resulting banding looks exactly like the banding that was made in the late 18th century. So let's go on and talk about some of those procedures now. Thanks. Most successful projects start with a plan. The Seymours use different types of dart pattern banding. The height and length of the chevrons relative to each other and to the overall width of the banding determine the look. Starting with a photograph of a known Seymour banding, I measured and scaled the proportions, then applied that scale for a banding with an overall width of 7/32 of an inch. At the drafting board, I created a simple drawing. I would need 4 dark veneers at 3/64 thick and 1 light veneer at a 32nd inch thick. The solid light chevrons would have to be the thickness of 2 3/64 dark veneers and 1 1/32 light veneer, or 1/8 inch thick. I also determined that the shorter light chevrons would be 21/64 long and the longer laminated chevrons would be 11/16 long. With the measurements determined, it's time to start slicing some veneer. When making veneers at a width of around 2 inches or less, I prefer using the table saw with a thin curved blade, using a technique I learned from Steve Latta. The blade is set just a hair above the height of the cut, and the fence is set slightly wider than the thickness of the desired veneer. A long push stick will move the stock through the cut safely. After slicing the holly at a strong 1/32, I reset the fence and use the same process to cut the rosewood at a strong 3/64. It is essential that you use a zero clearance insert to prevent the veneer from falling into the opening. You also want to check your setup. Ensure that your blade is exactly perpendicular to the table and that your fence is parallel to the blade. And of course, you want to make sure your stock was properly milled with a face at 90 degrees to the edge. When I am done at the table saw, I have my 5 pieces of veneer cut slightly thick. I made 1 extra piece from each species because sometimes stuff happens. Notice too that I'm using a dial caliper through each step of the process, checking thickness at several positions to monitor accuracy. To bring the veneer to its final thickness and to remove any machine marks, I run it through a drill press mounted drum sanding attachment. Patience and multiple light passes are the key to precision here. Notice that after I complete a pass, I rotate the stock and rerun it with the same face to the sanding drum. This will help to equalize any slight irregularities. Once I'm finished sanding all the veneers and happy that the thicknesses are where I want them to be, it's time to start gluing up. The first glue up will be to make the 3-part lamination for the longer chevrons. Here I'm using 2 rosewood and 1 holly to build up the lamination. I have my clamps and cauls ready, and should note that the cauls have been covered with clear packing tape to prevent the glue from sticking to them. Glue is spread on all surfaces. My glue spreading tool of choice is a hotel key card into which I filed a series of notches. Because the pack will be hard to see once I get it in the cauls, I wrap the pack with removable Scotch tape to prevent shifting when it's out of sight. Also, because the thin pack will be hard to see, I mark the caul with masking tape near the ends of the pack. This will give me a reference later when I begin to place the clamps. The pack remains clamped in the cauls overnight. I wish I had more of these Wetzlar 8-inch clamps. When the pack comes out of the clamps, it's time to plane an edge true with the bench and then rip the other edge clean and parallel on the table saw. I fashioned a simple sliding table for my bandsaw to cut the chevron blanks to length. Here, the stop is positioned for an 11/16 cut on the laminated chevrons. I'll reset the stop to 21/64 later and proceed to cut the blanks for the solid chevrons. Patience and a slow, steady feed rate is the secret to success here. You'll get a little fuzz at the bottom of the cut, which is easily removed by a couple of passes over a sanding block. The depth of cut and fence position have been set on the tombstone router table, and it's time to begin cutting the V on one end of the chevron. I set the push-in stick to hold the piece tight to the table. Place the hold-down hammer to press the piece firmly against the fence. Then I make a pass using the push-through stick. One pass leads to a cleanly cut and perfectly centered V through the end grain. After finishing the cuts on all of my laminated chevrons, I make the same cut on the solid chevrons. With the V cuts complete in both the laminated and solid chevrons, I reposition the fence to make the point cuts. This will take 2 passes. The fence is set with exactly half of the cutter head exposed. Notice that I've used this setup to point my push stick so it copes the V in the chevron. We'll need about 120 passes to finish the points so they'll all go together, end to end. And here we have the fit we were looking for. V's and points all cut, I prepare for gluing up the pack. I like to glue the pack up in 2 stages to make sure the chevrons stay together tightly. I start with a board coated with packing tape. To that, I apply a piece of masking tape sticky side up. Glue is applied to the point of the chevron and then pressed into the adjacent V and down into the tape. Every few chevrons, I place tape on top of the pack to pull it tightly. Periodically, I tape the pack down to keep it flat. I continue this process, alternating dark and light chevrons until the inner core is complete. Here you see the inner core fully glued. I let it set overnight before removing the tape. When the inner core is dry, it gets laminated between 2 pieces of dark veneer. Because this pack is thick enough and can be easily inspected between the cauls, there's no need to tape it or to mark the clamp positions. Basically, this is the same process I used to glue up the first lamination. The cauls are covered in packing tape to prevent the glue from sticking to them, and my clamps are at the ready. After the completed pack has dried overnight, it can be removed from the clamps and planed true on one edge. I love these shavings. With a piece of 1/4 inch plywood clamped to the bandsaw to create a 0 clearance table, I slice off a piece of banding that is 3/64 of an inch thick. A couple of passes with a hand plane prepares the pack for the next slice, and I'll just repeat that process until I get all the slices I can out of this pack. In the end, I was able to get 17 pieces of banding from a pack that was approximately 24 inches long and 1 1/2 inch wide. That's 34 linear feet.
Thanks for watching Pup Video.